Welcome back to the Beardsley Doctrine and part 2 of the American Death March. When we left off in part 1, we had just concluded phase 2 in 1960, and things had already started to take a turn for the worse for our country. But most people didn't realize it yet. Now, as we head into phase 3, titled Full Speed Ahead to Failure, there are countless acts of betrayal and or incompetence that push us along on this death march. This is true of every phase, but there are often a few large actions that seem specifically tailored to destroy whatever hope remained for our future. Phase 3 starts in 1960 because there's a death knell trio implemented immediately after this date that's so misguided that to me, it could only have been intended to inflict maximum damage on our country. And as I expected, it does. These 3 death knells are the War on Poverty, the Immigration Act of 1963, and the complete abandonment of the gold standard. If there's ever any doubt of the bad intentions or complete incompetence of those we trusted to lead our country, these 3 actions alone should have made it clear to every American. The War on Poverty starts the process of bankrupting regular Americans by an ever-increasing transfer of their middle-class wealth to an ever-growing class of Americans in need. And these Americans in need, created by the failures in the leadership of our government, are beholden to the government now for survival. And these people in need, they make up a huge voting bloc. A voting bloc that's easily convinced to vote for more increasing failure for our country, because that vote for failure is linked to their ability to receive life's basic needs from the government. Called the War on Poverty, but in reality this is a war on free independent Americans. Now why? Because the real outcome of the war on poverty is the bankrupting of working Americans, since the ever-increasing numbers of Americans in need on welfare requires ever-increasing amounts of money that must be taken off of working Americans. But in addition to bankrupting the free working Americans that built and fund our country, this new welfare scheme also begins to rob working Americans of their ability to influence the direction of our country by canceling out their votes. This giant voting bloc created by this devious welfare scheme must vote for more failed policies in our country, because those failed policies are packaged together with the funding for their food. And their vote, a vote for short-term survival at the expense of our long-term future, cancels out the votes cast by free Americans. Therefore, welfare is not only bankrupting free Americans, but it's also nullifying their vote and their opportunity to influence the direction of our country for the positive. This is a brilliant scheme, but it's evil nonetheless. But there is another way to quickly increase the tax burden on working Americans and diminish the value of their votes for freedom. The second death knell, the Immigration Act of 1963. This act allows an endless number of immigrants into our country from the world over, and most with little to no skills. Whether that was the desired outcome or not, I'll let you decide whether it was ignorance or betrayal that enables this endless stream of unnecessary, illegal, and legal migrants to flood into our country. This flood of immigrants, it will undermine real wage growth. It will betray the hopes of existing Americans in need, especially minority ones, from ever joining the middle class. And it will overburden our new welfare system. But it also creates another huge block of people that are beholden to the government. People that will bankrupt free Americans and, of course, nullify the votes of independent Americans fighting for freedom in our country. But the war on poverty, endless war, Vietnam in this case, increasing wealth of the government, and the Immigration Act of 1963, these liabilities create a financial burden on the American working class that's so huge that excessive taxation and debt alone can't fund it. And the gold standard and similar safeguards put in place to force financial responsibility on our government and ensure that our money supply had real value had to be eliminated completely now in phase 3, after already being weakened by FDR in phase 2 to fund a different war. Recall why the gold standard existed in the first place. 2 main reasons. First reason, to reduce the risk of inflation. Throughout history, governments are notorious for printing excessive money to enrich themselves, and this excessive money supply causes skyrocketing inflation. This should sound familiar to all of us since we're living through it now. So to prevent the excess printing of money, the government's required to back up the currency with a real commodity such as gold. The requirement to have gold prevents the excessive printing of money, since the government can't legally print more money until it can be backed up with real wealth, gold in this case. The second reason is that paper money itself, it's really just a piece of paper. It's worthless. People were forever suspicious of this due to the risk that if the government printed too much money for themselves, then the paper, just paper the people had, would be worthless. So to convince people to accept a piece of paper for their hard labor instead of a real commodity, the government backed up the paper currency with gold. Remember all that gold at Fort Knox? This was gold required to be held by the government so you could redeem your paper money for gold at a bank. A lot of people don't know this, but you could take your paper money to the bank at any time. For example, a $20 bill, and exchange that $20 bill for gold. But the money required to fund a welfare class and the endless war for profit schemes, these require so much money, first during phase 2 and then during phase 3, there isn't enough gold to fund it. So the gold standard, already decimated in phase 2, is completely abandoned in 1971. Now remember when our coins also had real value and were made with silver? If you possessed a coin, it had real value due to the silver content in it. But our government had taken the silver out of our coins and stripped them of any real value even before the gold standard was abandoned in 71. When did coins with silver stop being minted? If you're a coin collector, you know 1964 was the last year that coins contained silver. Now hopefully by now, none of us should be surprised that 1964 is right in the middle of the implementation of the Immigration Act, the war on poverty, and the Vietnam War. This is why we start phase 3 in 1960. So with the gold standard for our paper currency completely gone now, and with the silver in our coins also gone, which renders them both without real value, the government has the ability to print money for themselves and their friends as they see fit, and to put this burden of paying this debt back on the working class Americans. No need to seize the people's gold like FDR did in phase 2 to print more money for themselves. Oh, you didn't know about that? I suggest you look it up for yourself to see how the federal government made you a felon if you didn't turn your gold into them for exchange for paper money that possesses no real value. Now FDR did this to ensure he could fund the death of more than 250,000 American men and create millions more American casualties during World War II. Now this ever-increasing mountain of debt started in phase 2, but now growing even faster in phase 3. It's oftentimes created out of thin air since there isn't a requirement to back it up with gold anymore. But the money that Americans like you have to pay to service this debt, it doesn't come out of thin air. It gets taken from your hard work and taken away from your family. This trio of endless welfare, endless immigration, endless debt accelerate the destruction of America and cause a rapid decline of free, independent Americans and a huge rise in the Americans in need class. Now, oddly, this ever-growing welfare apparatus, spending more money every year, that's funded with the ever-increasing tax burden on you, it's adding people to the welfare rolls. It's not lifting them out of poverty as it was supposedly intended to do. And the welfare system seems intent on trapping people in poverty and ensuring that they stay beholden to the government for survival. To me, and hopefully you also, when you think about it, welfare doesn't fix any issues because it doesn't address the root cause of the problem. It simply treats the symptoms. And I'm not even sure it does that. The real problems are the failed policies that have destroyed opportunity in our country. And welfare is simply a smokescreen to hide the crumbling foundation that our future is built upon. While at the same time, it's being used as a weapon against free working Americans to undermine their wealth, power, and vote. And to ensure that this crumbling foundation can't be fixed. But I'll let you decide that as we progress through phase 3. So let's take a look at what happens in phase 3 when America begins a steeper, more obvious descent into failure. Let's start again with free, independent Americans. They continue to pay higher taxes, as shown by the increase in dollar signs in the highlighted red circle. Now, I know you thought it was almost impossible that working Americans could pay an even higher percentage of the total taxes that the government collects. But wow, look at the blue line. Working Americans are paying more in phase 3. So that means everyone else is paying less. I highlighted in yellow how working Americans paid nothing in phase 1, but then how it increased over 50% of the total in phase 2. And by the end of phase 3, again, shown in yellow, it's now over 70%. How did regular working Americans, people like you and me, keep getting tricked into paying more and more of the share every year while everyone else paid less? That's a great question. And these higher taxes, coupled with diminishing opportunity, begin to take a toll on Americans' power and wealth. Take a look at our money in the red box. With the government continuing to find new ways to separate you from your money, and the wealth of regular Americans keeps getting lower. Remember when Americans had this much wealth in the red box during phase 1 and most of phase 2? Now regular Americans only have this much wealth and power. Now one of the most alarming things that begins to take place is the due to these taxes. Higher government regulation of everything. In the beginning of the selling off of our manufacturing jobs to the highest foreign bidder, these failed policies are beginning to take a toll on our country's independence and our ability to remain free and independent. As a result, for the first time in our history, Americans falling into poverty start to exceed Americans who can work their way out of poverty. This is a huge shift. Take a look at the yellow arrow highlighted in the red circle. It changed direction. For the first time in almost 200 years, it's consistently happening that more Americans are falling into poverty from the middle class than the number of people that are able to work their way out of poverty and join the middle class. Remember, it used to be the other way around, and Americans worked their way out of poverty, but not anymore. But there's another significant change I want to make sure that you take note of. Look in the red box. There are now less free, independent working Americans. Remember that America was full of independent people, not beholden to the government or anyone else to survive. But there aren't as many anymore. Their numbers are dropping. Where did they go? They joined the Americans in need since they can no longer take care of themselves. Some are gone because their opportunities and jobs were sold off to the highest foreign bidder. Some are gone because they were replaced by cheap labor performed by illegal aliens or excessive legal immigration or refugees. Some are gone due to the corporate welfare schemes, and others just can't manage anymore after giving more and more of their wealth over to the ever-growing tax burden. All of these once free Americans have joined the Americans in need class who are beholden to the taxpayer through the government for their survival. So regular Americans are poorer, and they've diminished in numbers. But how's the government and their friends faring in phase 3? Let's take a look. Well, it looks like the government and their friends are doing great. They seem to have more power, more control, and more wealth than ever before due to all the wealth that the working class are transferring to them through the ever-increasing taxes and ever-growing web of bureaucracy that's beginning to control and monitor every facet of your life. But the government and friends are also reaping profits from endless around-the-world wars that require huge sacrifice of our children and our earnings, but generates great wealth and power for them. And with the gold standard gone, even if they can't take enough off of you, they have the ability to create money for themselves by saddling you with a debt, by just printing the money for themselves out of thin air that you have to pay for later, or recklessly finding somebody that will lend them the money. Look what happened to debt in phase 3. After almost 200 years, we'd already incurred a high debt load of $1.7 trillion, almost all of it due to the previous 47 years in phase 2. But in the next 30 years in phase 3, we tripled this amount to over $5 trillion by 1990. In just 30 years, we did triple the damage to the American people than was done in the first 200 years. Now, I was complaining at the end of phase 2 how using inflation-adjusted dollars, that just in 47 years, that group had increased the debt by $1.7 trillion. But look at this new criminal group in phase 3. In just 30 years, they tripled the debt. They increased it to over $5 trillion. This graph's in 2012 inflation-adjusted dollars, just to be clear. This isn't going up due to inflation. It's going up due to theft and betrayal. This is beyond imagination. Look at the red box that shows how the government and friends have more and more money. Remember in phase 1 that they only had this much? Then in phase 2 they created the personal income tax and invested your money in children and for-profit foreign wars, started to get richer at your expense. But still they only had this much. But now they have this much courtesy of excessive taxes on the American worker, profits from foreign wars, and the ability to take on debt or print money as they see fit. Now, how's big business doing in phase 3? Let's take a look. Well, it looks like they're doing very well for themselves also. It looks like they're paying less taxes to the government now. Look at the red circle. How could that be? They were paying this much in phase 2. See the $2 signs? But now they're back to only paying this much. Notice how there's only a single dollar sign now. How's that possible? Here's how. This is the amount of corporate income taxes paid from phase 1 to phase 3 as a percentage of the total government taxes paid. Somehow, shown in red during phase 3, it goes down. And business pays less of the total taxes, while regular Americans keep paying more. As a result of the lower taxes, favorable laws bought by lobbying Congress, selling off our jobs to the highest foreign bidders, and the start of the implementation of corporate welfare, where companies refuse to pay working Americans their wages and benefits that they need to survive, and instead they transfer this burden to the taxpayer to pay for their workers' benefits through the welfare system. Big business continues to gain in wealth and power, as shown in the red box as a result. Remember when they only had this much in phase 1? Then in phase 2 it increased to this much power and wealth. But now they have this much. This is great for big business, but bad for you and me. And what about immigration? The Immigration Reform Act was signed into law in 1963. What effect did it have? Would cause legal and illegal immigration to surge into our country, even though Congress claimed this wouldn't be the outcome. Well, guess what? They lied. Again. Now, we always had immigration. My grandparents and great-grandparents were immigrants. Maybe yours were also. But it was a manageable amount, as shown in the green box. But never like this, as shown by the huge increase in migrants in the red box. And what effect did it have on our country? Take a look at this graph showing how our foreign-born population surged after the Immigration Act of 1963. We only had 10 million foreign-born people in our country in 1960, but due to this new immigration law, by 1990, we had over 23 million foreign-born people here. We added about 13 million migrants, over double the amount that we had in just 30 years in phase 3. That's a 130% increase. Now, how did that increase compare to the percent increase in American-born population in our country? Our American-born population increased by only 31%, but our foreign-born by 130%. That's 4 times faster, and don't be fooled by this story. We always flooded our country with immigrants. This graph shows at the beginning of phase 3 that the percent of migrant population in America was stable at about 5%. It was actually going down before the Immigration Act of 63. Take a look after. After a few years of the full disastrous effect of this new immigration law begins to take effect, this new debt now allowed migrants to surge. They nearly doubled an insane amount to almost 10% as a percentage of the total population in America. Just 30 years between 1960 and 1990. And as a result of these failed policies, more money needs to be spent on welfare to provide for Americans in need that can't provide for themselves. This is due to the diminishing working class who can no longer support themselves due to their opportunity being sold off, and now they have to rely on welfare to survive. But it's also due to this huge influx of mostly lower skilled migrants, both legal and illegal, who rely on government programs to survive. The welfare system itself often incentivizes failure and traps Americans there. The bottom line, look how many Americans are in need now. Remember when there were only this many Americans in need? But due to endless immigration, lost opportunities, a failed welfare system, and corporate welfare forcing many working Americans to be in need, there are now this many and their numbers keep increasing. So as phase 3 concludes, things continue to change for the worse at a rapid pace, even though it was hard to imagine that we could do worse than in phase 2. The problem remained, though, that most people didn't even realize it. They didn't realize that by the end of phase 3, working Americans were now paying almost 75% of all the taxes. Nor did they realize that even though it took almost 200 years to accumulate our already high debt, $1.7 trillion by 1960, that during phase 3, just 30 years, we tripled this amount to over $5 trillion by 1990. Plus, most people didn't realize that we were already spending $64 billion on welfare in 1960. But during phase 3, this amount would increase by 600%, ballooned over $400 billion. And just to clarify, this $400 billion does not include Social Security, since Social Security is not a welfare program. This is all just spent on welfare. This $400 billion a year is more than any outright communist country in the world spends on social services. Take a look for yourself. Remember, these are inflation-adjusted dollars. This represents the actual welfare spending increase. Remember when an already high 12% of your taxes went to pay for welfare at the end of phase 2 in 1960? Now at the end of phase 3, 45% of your taxes go to support welfare spending, because supporting a giant voting bloc to nullify your own vote costs a lot of money. Now, a lot of people did begin to realize that something was going wrong with our immigration policy. But no one imagined that we would over double our migrant population, and migrants as a percentage of our total population would almost double in just 30 years, and over 13 million immigrants, illegal and legal, would flood our country and our welfare system. Nor did most people wonder why our government just couldn't stop it. Even though we still station about 30,000 U.S. troops just in Korea, and thousands of our military in several other places, just to protect the borders of these countries from illegal crossings, but not on our own border. As long as it wasn't one of your own sons being sacrificed on foreign wars, most families didn't seem to notice that for the better part of the next 30 years, all the money and all the lives of other people's children that were needed to be sacrificed in the name of patriotism and freedom. Now, even after deep thought, you couldn't possibly believe that we could continue to find enemies willing to engage the greatest military force in the history of the world. How could we find more fearless dictators, terrorist masterminds, many in countries a tiny fraction of our size, most even without an Air Force or Navy, willing to take us on? But somehow we found them during these 30 years. And we were convinced that these countries are sometimes just small gangs of men. They were a step away from taking over the world and ending our lives as we know it if we didn't act and send our money and children off to save the day. So as phase 3 wraps up, American taxpayers almost solely fund the government. Business somehow pays increasingly less. And remember how customs and tariffs and fees, they used to almost fund the whole government? Even though imports are on the rise in displacing American workers, this amount, shown by the purple line, continues to contribute a smaller percentage to the government's revenue. I'm not sure how this is logical or possible, but it's down to just 10%, even though it used to be over 90%. Now, on top of all these obvious negative trends, there's always some other canaries in the coal mine as well that should have tipped us off that there were more dire things to come. And of course there were. One particular one that was missed was what happened to our manufacturing jobs in phase 3. Or maybe what didn't happen. What didn't happen was real job growth. From 1960 to 1990, even though our population, shown in yellow, grew by 65 million people, a 35% increase, our manufacturing jobs only increased by 2 million, or 14%. And this increase took place in the first 6 years of phase 3. See how, as these disastrous phase 3 policies begin to take effect, job growth collapses. Shown here in red, there's zero manufacturing job growth for the next 24 years in phase 3, even as our population surged. Zero. All the way from 1966 to 1990. And of course, if during a time when our manufacturing job growth was zero, but our population increased by 51 million, you don't have to be an economist to see this will have a negative effect on our trade balance. Even though America, world powerhouse in manufacturing, had a positive trade balance for almost all of the previous 100 years, The failed policies of Phase 3 took only about 12 years to erode our trade balance, and in 1972, we find ourselves with our first negative trade balance in years. And by 76, it's over. America will never have another positive trade balance, ever. And it's not negative by a little either. The trade balance, now a trade deficit, will average over $100 billion for the last 7 years of Phase 3. This should have been another obvious sign that something was going seriously wrong with our country. But don't forget all the obvious signs. Most congressmen and politicians, on salaries not much more than most Americans, are somehow turning into millionaires after serving their terms. This should have seemed odd to most Americans, especially while regular Americans got poorer, but it didn't. Even though regular Americans continue to transfer ever-increasing amounts of their wealth to the government, who are using some of it to create a huge welfare class, the welfare class, whose marginal survival is only ensured if they vote to enrich and empower the government further and perpetuate more failure for our country, this should have tipped some people off. But this welfare scheme, it's a brilliant new scheme that manipulates our emotions and our desire to help people. But instead of helping people, it hurts people by destroying their dignity. And it pays them. No, really it extorts them with your money to cancel out your vote so they can continue to eat. But only if they support the very things that have destroyed their own future and are sure to destroy ours. It's crazy. Well, things are starting to look bleak on America's march. What's ironic about this time, and it'll be studied by psychiatrists and sociologists for centuries to come, is how people were convinced to believe that we were winning, that we were succeeding. People believed that America was winning at this time in spite of all the obvious signs that we were losing, and losing big. Now, I know it's easier to look back today and see it, but we were losing jobs, losing our money, losing wars, while we lost our children in these wars, losing our families to drugs and crime, losing our freedoms, losing our rights. Now, I competed a lot in my day, and this, my friends, is exactly what losing looks like. But somehow, people were convinced by our government and the media that this was winning. I was even fooled. I was fooled to believe that I was going to defend our Constitution when I joined the Army. Even though there were already 70 consecutive years of wars where we sent our money and children off to die as a mercenary force for a small corrupt group to get rich. Myself and millions of others, all convinced into believing that this deception wasn't treason, but it was actually patriotism. People were convinced that selling our jobs and our economic futures off to foreign countries to the point where we couldn't even produce what our own country needs to survive, this wasn't insanity, but this was the right thing to do. People were convinced that endless welfare, even though it destroyed our families and neighborhoods, was an actual solution to the problem rather than a weapon that was being used to destroy our country. People were convinced that reckless immigration was good for our economy, even as Americans in need, our poor citizens, were convinced of that. And they asked for more of it, even though more immigrants would ensure that they would forever be trapped in poverty due to having to compete for the fleeting jobs and opportunity in our country with millions of new migrants imported into our country. It beats me. People were even convinced that unlimited access to drugs to destroy our families and murder our children was unavoidable. People were convinced that as our neighborhoods started to resemble third world country, that this wasn't due to the consequences of these disastrous policies being inflicted upon us, but this was somehow due to racism. People were convinced that the destruction of our families and churches was actually freedom. Even smart people were convinced that destroying our manufacturing base so that this manufacturing could be done in foreign countries that pollute even more than we do was a good idea. Somehow they were convinced to believe that creating more pollution was actually good for the environment. People were even convinced that God doesn't grant your rights, but the government does it. The list goes on. But Americans were convinced we were doing great. How? Who knows? Like I said, I'll leave that to be studied in future generations. But we saw it, we lived it. And we may even been fooled ourselves at the time. When you're losing 63 to nothing at halftime, When your coach comes in the locker room and tells you and the team that you're doing a great job, keep up the good work, I think it might be time for a new coach. But not here. No. Not this time. Instead, the most unbelievable part. We extended a contract for these leaders by voting them back into office so they can inflict more damage and death upon our families. Half the country even did this enthusiastically, while the other half, they were beginning to recognize something was wrong. But this other half, they failed to recognize the group that they were supporting. Even though this group touted themselves as part of the solution, they were also part of the problem. It really didn't matter who you supported. Both sides of the coin were the same. But people didn't see it. They still thought winning the coin toss meant something. Now remember that far up place in the distance? It seemed like we were marching towards when we were finishing up phase 2. It was hard to tell exactly where we were going. And none of us were 100% sure. If you look far off on the horizon, I thought it looked like out there was a graveyard. But now that we're closer, I'm pretty certain that we're marching to a graveyard. Our graveyard, America's final resting place. Now once again, the warning signs are there, the impending danger. But few seem to listen. It's hard to believe. Even after all that's gone on, all that's been wrong up to this point, all that's been lost, most are still too busy or disinterested to listen. Some don't listen because they're taking victory laps from all this fictitious winning we were told we were doing. Others don't hear because they're nursing sore shoulders from patting themselves and each other on their backs for doing their part to ensure more failure for our country. Some are too busy to hear because they're working too hard, trying to overcome the overwhelming obstacles put in their way by the government. Whatever they're doing, they either just don't hear or don't seem to care. And most blindly and enthusiastically march on anyways. And at this point, I'm not sure what level of betrayal, what level of incompetence, or how much pain and misery will be required for them and their families to comprehend and experience, to comprehend the danger ahead. But clearly as phase 3 concludes, we haven't reached that point yet, with the media and the government urging them on, controlling what they get to see and hear with endless repetition, filling their mind with grand tales of our latest successes. They march on convinced that we really are headed to paradise. But they're not. As for the people like me, there's not even an opportunity for us to debate the facts. Because not only are we deemed wrong, but we're called crazy conspiracy theorists, people who hate America, lack patriotism. But they don't provide any proof to support this. They don't have to, because repetition alone convinces most people just to march on. So we push forward to phase 4. Now I'm going to conclude this session here. And the next time we meet, we'll pick up with phase 4, where another weapon, just barely used up to this point, will be improved upon and much more effectively deployed against us with deadly consequences that will accelerate the demise of our futures. Also, as hard as it may be to believe, there will be a doubling down on more of the same failed policies that have led us down this dangerous path up to this point. You would have thought that every American, both working Americans and the millions of Americans trapped by the welfare scheme in perpetual failure, they would have reached a breaking point by now. But not so. Some working Americans did, but their vote was canceled out already by the millions beholden to the state to survive. Even many on welfare had enough. They were wise enough to conclude that this welfare scheme was no solution at all to the lack of opportunity in our country, but rather it was a ticket to ensure more failure. But they were unable to do much since they still had to vote in more failure so they could eat the next day. So how long can it go on? How much more hardship, pain, suffering can be inflicted on regular Americans before they will have had enough? Let's find out the answer to that when we meet next. Let's find out if you've guessed what the new weapon of choice is that gets unleashed on us in phase 4. And maybe we even get to the conclusion of our journey as well. Or maybe not. In either case, be forewarned. Carrying on beyond this point is not for the faint of heart. But I trust you're going to be brave enough to join me anyways. I'll see you next time.